Welcome to Bible study tonight, friends.
Dun, 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 bum, bum, bum. This is Travis Rogers, leading you on an adventure through the Mediterranean, following Paul's steps and the letters that he wrote to the churches. How's that?
Fabulous.
So we are we are tonight going to start with Paul's letter to the Philippians. Paul's letter to the Philippians was written to the church that he himself had established in the city of Philippi, which was a leading city in the province of Macedonia. They were located on the Via Egnatia, which was a major east-west highway linking Rome by way of the Adriatic Sea with Byzantium and the east. Philippi was a wealthy city, and they had the added distinction of being an urban center of the Roman colony, which gave the people a certain sense of privilege, including Roman citizenship. And remember, that's a big deal for Paul, because as a citizen of Tarsus, he was also granted Roman citizenship, and he wound up using that in the trial in Jerusalem when he appealed to Caesar by saying that he was a citizen of Rome. What that meant was when a person gave the word civis Romanus, I'm a citizen of Rome, it suspended judgment from all lower courts. And now the court for the trial would have to be moved to Rome. That was a card that Paul played in order to get to Rome, maybe. Anyway, the founding of the church at Philippi is described in Acts chapter 16, verses 6 through 40. But that account actually doesn't provide a whole lot of help in interpreting the letter to the Philippians, except for confirming the fact of the prominent role of women in the church. Paul probably visited Philippi once or twice after having founded the church and maintained a particularly cordial relationship with the congregation there. At the time of the writing of the letter, Paul is in prison, probably in Rome, but maybe he's also at Syria Maritima or Ephesus because of their closeness to Philippi and because of hints of severe affliction at Ephesus instead. But because there's no real consensus of Paul's place of imprisonment at that point, there's no consensus on the date of the letter either. You'll see some people who will move it earlier, and mostly earlier in the time. Some suggest that maybe it was as early as 52, but as Walter Harrelson used to say, in my judgment, Paul was in fact writing from Rome, and the year is probably 62. It's not long before Paul's execution. So what prompted Paul to write? The immediate occasion was that he had a courier. He had somebody who could take the letter. Without a regular postal service available in that region, travelers were often asked to carry letters on behalf of persons if they happen to be going by that way or to that place. So Epaphroditus, he's a member of the church at Philippi, who had earlier brought a gift to Paul from that church. He's going to return home, and so he provides a ready means of delivering the letter. There are other reasons for Paul wanting to communicate with them also. The Philippians had heard of Paul's imprisonment, and Paul was wanting to reassure them of his unabated joy, even in the circumstances that he suffered, and he wanted to pass along his confidence as to the outcome. Also, to express his gratitude for their gift and their constant friendship. Philippians is probably the most joyful letter, start to finish, of all of Paul's writings. But for all that, I tend to see things a little bit different regarding those reasons for writing. If Paul was really in Rome and under house arrest, as I suspect he was, I think that Paul was looking for a means to send those closest to him away from the danger that he's in. I think Paul wanted to be assured that Luke and Epaphroditus and Timothy and others were at a safe distance before Paul's fate befell him. That's the love that's inside of Paul. And he would suffer the thing he hated most, and I'm convinced that thing he hated most was loneliness. He would suffer that in order to save those that he loved. That's the heroic nature of Paul. It wasn't braving the beatings or the hunger or being shipwrecked. It wasn't any of those things. I think that Paul suffered those things almost gladly, but it was loneliness that was unbearable for him. And that's exactly what he embraced in order to protect his friends. Paul sends them away. It's the most loving thing he can do, and he gives them a mission and a reason to depart. Which is why when you look at the end of the book of Acts, because remember, Luke is there with him, in the book of Acts, it doesn't talk about the death of Paul. In fact, at the end of Acts, Paul is still alive and all is well. Because Luke wasn't a witness to the death of Paul, nor was Epaphroditus or Timothy or any of the rest of them. Well, for the writing in the church at Philippi, the church there had certainly faced some problems, but there's no real consensus over the nature or extent of those problems. Certainly the church was engaged in a struggle like Paul's. That is to say, there was persecution going on by the non-Christian authorities in Philippi. And Paul wanted to encourage them through his own example with an exhortation to stand fast in their faith. But there were also warnings of other sorts of opponents. There were people who were presenting a gospel that was different from Paul's. Paul calls them dogs and evildoers and enemies of the cross. Those are all his phrases that he uses there. And various groups have been suggested as the object of those warnings, whether they were Jewish missionaries who were coming to uproot the newly planted Christian church, or are they Jewish Christians, or are they Judaizing missionaries, libertines, antinomians. Antinomians means those who believe there was no law. Those who would preach freedom from moral restraint. Jewish Gnostics, perfectionists who claimed spiritual and moral superiority, and those called pneumatics who believed that they had already been raised to a new life. Some scholars see the threat to the community by two or more of these groups. Others see a single group that's being behind the warnings, and still others challenge the assumption that these warnings were directed against persons who are actually threatening the faith of the church. They suggest instead that Paul mentions these people as part of his argumentative or rhetorical strategy, which was familiar in the moral discourses of his time, by showing the contrasting behavior of friends and enemies in order to build up the church and for their motivation. Here's how our friends act, here's how our enemies act. That was something very common at the time. It also shows, or we also have a strong support for this interpretation. But finally, the church faced some kind of internal problem as well. There's a repeated admonition in Philippians to think the same thing. And that points to some tension inside the congregation. In chapter 4, verse 2, the admonition is specifically addressed to two women who are active leaders in the church. Paul doesn't mention the source of the tensions, but the way the issue permeates the letter suggests that it's not a personal matter, but one that involved their leadership and affected the whole church. In fact, the issue between them may have been a primary cause for Paul's writing the letter in the first place. But Paul's comments are too brief, and in order to show us what really is the underlying nature of the difficulty. The emphasis throughout the letter is on virtues like affection and loyalty, sharing and harmony and reciprocity, which suggested that the letter can be best understood as a letter of friendship. That's an established type of correspondence in the Greek world. It takes on something different than the more preaching letters. In that world, friendship had a contractual quality as well as a competitive one, really. And concern for friends included concerns about one's enemies also. The letter also contains a whole lot in the moral instruction in the form of exhortations and warnings, like we mentioned, personal examples, both positive and negative, and there were references to opponents throughout the whole thing. And then there is in chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, is what has been called the hymn of Christ, which serves as a aid to his moral instructions. There's several qualities of the letter that are in sharp contrast in tone. At chapter 3, verses 1, there's the postponement of the expression of his thanks for the Philippians gift until the very end. Some scholars have been led to suggest that the letter, as we have it, was composed of fragments of 3 independent letters that were written that had all been combined into one. Those letters are defined as approximately chapter 4, verses 10 through 20, which was an initial letter of thanks. Then chapter 1, verses 1 through chapter 3, the first part of verse 1 is, and then a third one is in chapter 4, sorry, I drew a blank. Chapter 4, verses 2 through 9, and 4, verse 21 through 23, which was the letter that was sent back with Epaphroditus. The first part of the verse on, pardon me, sorry, the second part of verse 1 of chapter 3, running through, like I said, chapter 4, the first part of verse 1, may be a letter that was actually attacking some of the Judaizing missionaries that had come. Close analysis, though, supports, and I believe this, it supports the integrity of the letter, because all the sections of it are thematically and rhetorically, literarily tied together. This isn't one of those letters that had suffered at the hands of an editor, like we talked about with 2 Corinthians. Once again, in my judgment, the letter is a single unity written by one guy, Paul, that was before his execution. The fact that there are overlapping sections and sometimes vaguely defined transitions makes the letter difficult to outline, but that seems the main proof that it's not written as a theological treatise, as much as it was a letter of warmth and affection to a congregation that was still close to his heart. As you read it, and as you're getting to the end, it's like his thanksgiving and his benediction is very, I'm going to stick with the word warm. This is a community that Paul really, really loves. He has a great familial relationship with them, and he says in one verse, "You've never given me a cause for heartache." So the letter to the Philippians is probably the last letter written to any church by Paul. At the same time as Paul had composed his letter to this church, he concludes, apparently, his correspondence with a letter to an individual. That takes us to the next letter from Paul, and that's the letter to Philemon. Boy, it's short. It's only about 1 page in text, written text. And once again, Paul is in the letter to Philemon writing against a sea of troubles. Paul was in jail, and he had to, he couldn't see the people that were involved, 2 guys that he really loved. Couldn't see them, couldn't get close to them, couldn't put his arms around both of them, and yet he's got to find some way to fulfill his commitment to a joint project that he had established with this congregation that was now under the leadership of Philemon. Philemon and Apphia and Archippus. Those were the 3 guys who were in charge of the church there. So Paul's having to write this letter while he's still in chains. And so Paul sends a representative in the person of Philemon's own brother, Onesimus. Paul describes them as being brothers in the flesh and in the Lord. Paul's pretty aware that the 2 brothers are estranged, maybe because of some past wrongdoing or debt for which Onesimus has failed to compensate Philemon, knowing that the estrangement threatens Paul's relationship and his ministry to Philemon and the congregation. Paul writes this very diplomatic letter that presents Onesimus as his agent or proxy, and Paul writes that he loves Onesimus, and he insists that Philemon receive Onesimus as he would receive Paul himself. Again, in this very, very short letter, we have so much of Paul in this, so much of his personality, so much of his self-sacrifice even. To strengthen Paul's appeal to Philemon, he promises him that he will repay any and all debts that Onesimus may have incurred or may incur in the future. Paul signs with his own signature, and then there looks like there's some kind of a veiled threat that he'll come to Philemon himself in the near future to inspect Philemon's hospitality and compliance. So the traditional interpretation of Paul's letter is that Paul is stepping into the middle of this conflict on behalf of a repentant runaway slave, and Paul is trying to reconcile the slave with his angry slave master. Boy, what damage that has done. A careful reading of the letter nowhere suggests that Onesimus belongs to Philemon. Nowhere does Paul refer to Philemon as a lord or a master or anything like that. Nowhere. So to identify Onesimus as a slave falls within chapter 2, verse 6, where Paul writes, "Receive him no longer as a slave, but more than a slave." Well, okay, so that's where we get that Onesimus was a slave. That's all. The key word in that verse, however, is not slave, but the word as. That's the important word, because it includes a virtual and not an actual state of affairs. Paul uses this word with precisely the same sense in the next verse when he tells Philemon to receive Onesimus as you would receive me. So some people say Onesimus was a fugitive, but again, there's no indication of that in the letter. Read the letter. It's short. You won't find it. Paul does not hint at a reason for why Onesimus escaped. And it was really starting with a guy I normally like, and that's John Chrysostom. He was a 4th century Greek scholar living about the same time as the great St. Augustine over in the West. And John Chrysostom is the first to propose the idea that Philemon, the letter to Philemon, is a letter trying to reconcile slave and master. He proposes that Onesimus was a fugitive slave on whose behalf Paul is now writing the letter to Philemon. Chrysostom was worried that many people of his time had been reduced to blasphemy by saying that Christianity had been introduced into life for the subversion of everything. Well, Pastor Elizabeth asked before we began, is there any one verse that sticks out to me? And I mentioned Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Well, with that kind of idea, there were some in John Chrysostom's time who were saying that, there's complete freedom. There's freedom from any kind of restraint. There's freedom of individuals. That during John Chrysostom's time, masters were having their servants taken away from them, and sometimes in a rather violent way. So Chrysostom was addressing the damage being done to the Christian community, which is publicly associated with the aggressive freedom of slaves. Now, Chrysostom was a great admirer of the Apostle Paul, and he was rather annoyed that the letter to Philemon was being dismissed by some of his contemporaries as a trifling matter because it really had little to contribute to Christian dogma and doctrine. Apparently, the reputation of the Christian community was being ruined by libertarians in the middle of them who were challenging slavery, which was an institution of great importance to the Roman imperial order. So the letter let's fast forward ahead a few centuries. The letter to Philemon then becomes, sadly, in the subsequent history of its interpretation, a legal brief of slavery, in support of slavery. In America, the pro-slavery advocates would always refer to Philemon as what they called the Pauline Mandate. This was a biblical sanction of American slavery. Plantation owners understood that Onesimus is a runaway, and so they cited Philemon in support of the fugitive slave laws, which required the return of runaway slaves to their masters under the penalty of law, even when the fugitives had escaped to free states. If you saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, there were these guys who were in a free state who captured the free man and took him back as if he were a runaway, took him back south. Now, some Christian leaders were not committed to the slave regime, and they insisted on an alternative interpretation of Philemon. I'm still talking about in American slave history. The African American slaves had protested that the letter, number one, isn't truly Pauline, and it doesn't contain the gospel. And others were saying, no, it is Paul, but it's simply, you're reading it wrong. So according to the abolitionists, the letter says nothing about Onesimus' servile status. And in calling Onesimus a beloved brother, both in the flesh and in the Lord, as Paul says, Paul's suggesting that Onesimus is not Philemon's slave, but actually his blood brother. That is, in the flesh. And brother in faith, by faith in the Lord. Other interpreters suggested that the letter does not take a position on slavery at all. The writer uses, and Paul uses, a vocabulary of love and family to describe his relationship both with Philemon and with Onesimus, and in their relationship to each other. Paul takes a diplomatic tone when he's addressing Philemon, and he takes a tone that is also determined but self-sacrificial, because he is concerned about the reconciliation of these estranged brothers. So at issue here is family, ministry, and love. Paul can't do the work of the gospel in Philemon's assembly without the reconciliation of the two brothers. Now, people who were saying there was no theological point or no doctrinal point missed the point, because the text isn't about forgiveness. No, that's been addressed in other places. Paul instead is talking about the possibility of his emissary's, Onesimus, wrongdoing, and in order to address that, he's willing to offer a concrete remedy for that. And Paul's going to do that at his own expense. He's going to sign off on a debt that Onesimus may owe his brother, and Paul's intervention is then a radical and probably expensive experiment in peacemaking. Paul insists that the love between those in the Lord cannot be fulfilled when love is grown cold between those who are brothers in the flesh. The crisis of family strife isn't merely a concern of the church. It is a crisis of the church. And Paul is anticipating that crisis, and anticipating that crisis makes ministry impossible. So he offers to underwrite the cost of justice. He will subsidize the debt owed by Onesimus, because without justice, there is no peace. I know you've heard that phrase before. And without peace between the brothers, there can be no ministry. I say brothers meaning Onesimus and Philemon. Between siblings, but also siblings in the Lord. Unless and until justice is served, God cannot be served, is Paul's point. So his insistence on forgiveness in the face of injustice is a special pleading for what Dietrich Bonhoeffer would call cheap grace. That when there is such rank injustice in the world, and to simply call for some kind of blanket forgiveness, no, Bonhoeffer said that price is just too great to be so cheaply given. The debt has to be paid, which is why Paul, with no admission of guilt on the part of any of the principals involved, he doesn't talk about the guilt of Onesimus, although he's willing to pay for it. He doesn't talk about the guilt of anger and intransigence on the behalf of Philemon. And so he's saying that without any of that on the principles involved, he offers to expend his moral and financial capital to reconcile these two beloved brothers, both in the flesh and in the Lord. It is an extraordinary letter. It's one that bears close reading, because that's how much unity meant to Paul. That's how much that having siblings in the flesh and siblings in the Lord being in harmony with each other, how important that was to him, because like he said, you're not going to have any ministry. Ministry will be impossible when there is open warfare like that in the family, in the congregation. That's Paul's last letter that is what we call undisputed. There's only, 7 of them. Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, and 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Colossians, Romans, and Philippians. After that, it now gets a little more uncertain as to, did Paul really write this thing or other? That's going to be an issue, but we shouldn't make too big of an issue of it. For example, when we're talking about New Testament scholarship and historical criticism, we know that the 4 Gospels, for example, were anonymous in their original circulation. It wasn't until later that names like Matthew and John and Luke and Mark get attached. So what those names, what those credits, writing credits, what they mean is that they are reflecting the viewpoint of that particular person. So to say that, oh, well, Mark didn't really write Mark, or John didn't really write John, is really kind of missing the point of what the letters are about. They represented the communities of those apostles. And so they were written on behalf of the names of those to whom the community was so closely tied. So 2 Thessalonians. It was traditionally called the second because it was shorter than the first letter that Paul wrote to the Thessalonians. Because of its beginning in chapter 1, verse 1, which reads, Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy to the church of the Thessalonians in God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, it was attributed to Paul. Seemed like no-brainer, right? But in the late 18th century, biblical scholars who were using a new method at the time called historical critical study. And remember, critical doesn't mean fault finding, although it usually does include that, but it means critical as in detailed analysis. So with this historical critical analysis of the New Testament, we wind up being a little skeptical about Paul's authorship of the letter. Then 20th century scholarship provided evidence for us that Hellenistic writers would very often write in the name of a revered teacher, either to honor them or to enable their teachings to carry on, to be applied to new situations. If we understand that, then some of the doubts that's been expressed about authorship of 2 Thessalonians are being considered again. Paul noted that, or no, sorry, not Paul. Scholars have noted that the outline of 2 Thessalonians is very much like 1 Thessalonians, including the rather strange feature of there being 2 Thanksgiving sections. When you look at Paul's letters, those Thanksgiving sections will occur usually within the first chapter. Sometimes it'll come later, like we were just talking about with Philippians, but it's usually one section. So in 1 Thessalonians, there are 2 Thanksgiving sections, and 2 Thessalonians follows the very same thing. Now, of course, it makes you start to wonder, well, in Thessalonica, is it accustomed to have 2? No, there's no other evidence from any other writing that this was something unique to the people of Thessalonica. Further, the vocabulary of 2 Thessalonians echoes very closely that of 1 Thessalonians, but its style is really, I'm going to use the phrase wooden, more wooden than Paul's very lively style that he uses in all the other letters. Paul's a very good writer, and 2 Thessalonians just doesn't look like it came from the same pen. It may have come from an adolescent pen of Paul, but that would have been before Paul ever got to Thessalonica in the first place. So 2 Thessalonians it doesn't have those affectionate expressions that is found so often in First Thessalonians. There's also a clear difference between, and this is the big point, between the second coming of Christ, eschatology we call it, doctrine of the end times. So in First Thessalonians, in chapter 4, verses 13 through 18, we have the expectations of a return of Christ in near time, in near future, the very near future. But in Second Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1 through 12, now it's taken on the aspect of being unknown. We don't know when it's going to happen, and it's somewhere in the far distance. Now, while Paul may have changed his mind, that change would have had to happen pretty quickly. If both First Thessalonians and Second Thessalonians had in fact been sent by Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy, then they necessarily would have had to have been sent within a relatively short time of each other. More than that, Second Thessalonians suggests that there were other letters of Paul that were already in circulation, something that was very unlikely in Paul's lifetime, especially if the letter was going to follow closely on First Thessalonians, which was in the year 51, then there's not enough time to have passed for Paul's letters to have become so well circulated. By the end of the 20th century, the majority of biblical scholars have concluded that Second Thessalonians is a tract that's written in the style of First Thessalonians by a disciple of Paul who wanted to update Paul's teachings on the second coming, on the future coming of Christ. The first generation of Christians expected the second coming, or as the Greek word is parousia, to occur during their lifetimes. It didn't happen. And when it didn't happen, and especially when Paul dies, it's time to rethink the nature of the parousia. Second Thessalonians represents that attempt by one of Paul's scribes or students or associates to do just that. Simply alter the timetable. Is Christ coming back? Absolutely. Is he coming back today? Probably not. Is he coming back tomorrow? Kind of doubt it. But he's coming back, and it's going to be sometime in the future. So the author of Second Thessalonians is now trying to, because imagine what the folks there were thinking as the trials and tribulations had not disappeared, but they were hanging on there because, the Lord's going to come back, and then they're going to get theirs, and everything is going to be fine with us. Paul dies at the hands of the Romans. Nero has him beheaded, and still no return. Well, so a student of Paul would have wanted it to say, okay, look, let's revise the timetable here. Yes, he's coming back. Don't know when. So we don't know who actually wrote Second Thessalonians, if it wasn't Paul. And we can only speculate about when the author did the writing. We can guess that the writer who composed Second Thessalonians did so sometime after Paul had died. And I would suspect sometime soon after Paul had died. Some thought that maybe Paul was writing that, or that the author was writing this later in the first century, when writing letters in Paul's name had become more possible and popular. I think that it was the death of Paul that caused the rethinking of their understanding of the end times. During Nero's reign, Christian groups were beginning to face increased pressure and hostility within their own social context. And some of them were turning to a renewed hope in the return of Christ in light of all those pressures. The author is probably from a Christian group, maybe one of the churches that Paul had established. Maybe somebody who had read First Thessalonians. I mean, clearly they've read First Thessalonians, because in writing this new one, they use a lot of the structural devices that we find in First Thessalonians. Again, could have been one of Paul's associates or scribes. He was writing with good intention to resolve the problems that Christians of his day were facing, and he chose to do it in the name of Paul, the founder and hero of his church. Obviously, Paul's name is a name who would be heard and heeded. Writing as the apostle himself, the writer urges his readers to keep the faith and to maintain their hope, but don't expect the end of the age in the near future, not in the immediate future anyway. God's plan for the end was in process of being implemented, but believers shouldn't be too eager. Rather, live only for today and for tomorrow, and tend to the needs of today. Take responsibility for your actions. Again, a theme that Bonhoeffer would make great use of by saying, stop thinking that the Lord is going to come back and deliver us from the Nazis. We have to take responsibility. So the writer of 2 Thessalonians is saying, suffer boldly and wait faithfully for the day of judgment, the day of the end, when all of your longings will be fulfilled and your afflictions will be vindicated. So even if the letter is not Paul, and it is probably not, the letter is uniquely important in seeing the shift of the eschatologies, the doctrine of the end times. These writings are called pseudonymous writings. And I don't like it when they use phrases like forgery, because it makes it sound like there's some bad intent. So we shouldn't think of these pseudonymous writings as forgeries in the sense of propagating a falsehood. Rather, and this was common in the Greco-Roman world, these letters were written in the names of famous people in order to give weight to the importance of the message. And like I said, in order to propel that message to a new audience or a new situation. The 2 Thessalonians is the first and probably earliest of these pseudonymous writings. They're often called Deutero-Pauline writings, meaning not undisputed writings of Paul, but rather a second Pauline canon. Deutero just means second. Next time, then, we're going to look at the others that carry great weight in the church. The epistle to the Ephesians is a powerful letter. Is it written by Paul? Probably not. But it is certainly written by somebody who is very, very familiar. I'm going to use the word intimate with Paul's theology and Paul's understanding. It represents Pauline theology, even if it's not from the pen of Paul himself. And then we'll talk about 1 Timothy, Titus, 2 Timothy, and that'll take us to the end. So here we are, wrapped up with part 3. And here's a good time for, if you have any questions or comments or tic-tacs, let me know.
Thanks, Travis. I'm going to spotlight myself. I don't think I saw any things come up in the chat, but I had a couple questions that occurred to me, and so others share in the chat or get ready to share after. So first, for Philemon, I honestly don't remember for myself hearing that they could be blood brothers, Onesimus and Philemon. So that feels new to me, but as I was listening to you tell the story, what came to mind to me is the story often talked about as the prodigal son, but the father who had 2 sons.
Yes.
And that's what came to mind, because what if that younger son who had gone away met someone who helped transform his life? He had no idea what he was going back to. And so what debt might be anticipated or what might be going on, that gave me a context with a really familiar story to
Yes.
put that into.
Well, thinking about how inheritances worked in those days, it's easy to draw that correlation between the prodigal son and the elder brother and Philemon and Onesimus. I completely agree with that. It is we don't know again what the debt was, but was it the very same case where he took his portion of an inheritance and left with it, spent it all partying, and now he's wanting to come back home? Well, he would be coming home in disgrace. Paul would certainly be looking to rescue a beloved brother from disgrace like that, and certainly would not want to send him back into a situation in the church where there's going to be open warfare between blood brothers as well as siblings in the Lord. So yeah, that is an excellent context for that. Yeah, I know we have always been told that Onesimus is a slave. It just doesn't bear out on the reading, especially when you're looking at the, as Paul's writing was, again, like I said, it's the as, you're treating him as a slave. Don't do that. Rather, treat him as you would treat me if I were there. So Paul uses a harsh image in slave, and that's obviously just intended to grab his attention and to maybe make him think, oh, I never meant it as a slave. I never thought I would have had treated him like a slave. And Paul is saying, yeah, that's kind of what you did though. So it's that, again, that section of brothers in blood and in the Lord. That's not to say that is not a figure of speech. It is pointing to their sibling relationship.
Well, and I'll ask the question that I have asked each week of like that nugget to carry forward, and maybe we've touched that on Philemon. And I had one that came to mind when you were talking about Philippians, Paul bearing loneliness to protect his friends. I was like, ooh, that hits for today.
Doesn't it?
Kind of, yeah.
Yes. I mean, for you and Phil, pastors who love your congregation so much, to have to be separated by that, to have to bear the, not loneliness that you don't have anybody with you, because both of you have spouses, but yeah, there is a loneliness of not being together. And even though we can do Zoom and we can see each other, and Laura Lee can fake it on us by putting a statue of Dorothy up there, still we know that she's there with us. But something about being in each other's presence that makes it rather lonely when we can't do that. But we take what we can get. We do like Paul says, you know what? Tough it out, and there she is. Paul says, tough it out, and this will all be over at some point. So, yeah.
All right, Raymond, you had a question, right? Thanks for
I was going to ask if this person traveling with Paul, Luke, is that Luke the apostle?
Yes, Luke, the one who wrote the Acts of the Apostles, or at least, his name is attached to it. His name is attached to the Gospel according to Luke. But yeah, this is the Luke that traveled with him on those missionary journeys and was a very faithful scribe and follower and companion of Paul. Yep, the very same guy.
Cool. Other questions? And I'll pause the reading for just a moment. All right, hello. We stopped recording for a few moments so we could have discussion in our Zoom room. And I'm just doing a quick recap of what we talked about and heard as questions and Travis's excellent answers. So first, the question came up of like, who is the Luke that's traveling with Paul? And it is the same person credited with writing the Acts of the Apostles. So yes, it's the Luke you've heard of. We then looked at a couple of things in Philippians chapter 4 at the beginning of the chapter and the end. Verse 3, it mentions a companion who is encouraged to help the women that Paul references with their dispute and situation. And likely that it's the bearer of the letter who had just shut this, so Epaphroditus, close enough. Or it could be, someone else. And I love Travis shared a little bit of maybe it's a code name they have. Like if you have grandparents or aunts or uncles who had nicknames for each other. And as he shared a story of his grandparents who never called each other by their right name, made me think about my maternal grandpa, who I have to literally have a list for he and his siblings because they all wrote poetry and letters to each other under different names. So you need to have an index for looking over their compiled letters to each other. And then at the end of chapter 4 of Philippians, verse 22, we talked about those greetings from the emperor's household. And Travis reminded us that that's likely referring to the guards because they were part of the praetorium. They were part of that household of the emperor. And I love this line of, you can't be close to somebody like Paul or like Bonhoeffer or Nelson Mandela without coming away a changed person. And Travis referenced that one of Bonhoeffer's guards actually was going to help free him. Again, those transformational relationships of being close to each other. And those Roman guards wanted to greet people that they might never meet in person. And throughout the study tonight, Travis emphasized that really pastoral heart of Paul and holding each other as precious, just like we hold each other precious today. And the last note is in the notes from this recording, we'll have information about some other upcoming book studies on C.S. Lewis, on some other things with our synod. So watch for that information as well, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.